Good morning. Yes. It's been 3 weeks in the gospel, the last two that you heard about Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well. All of them feature darkness and light. Seeing and not seeing is really the theme of all 3 of these weeks as we march our way through Lent and towards Easter. With Nicodemus, you remember he comes in the midst of darkness. He has his conversation with Jesus at night, and he leaves still at night in darkness. The Samaritan woman last week, you might remember, comes to Jesus at noon, in the middle of the daylight. And she sees Jesus for who he is. She returns to the village and says, I have seen the one who might be the Messiah. He knows everything about me, and yet he accepts me for who I am. She comes to Jesus in the middle of the day, in the light, and she is able to see clearly who he is. And today we get the story of the healing of the man who is born blind. No chance to see in his whole life. All his life has been spent in darkness until he meets Jesus. As the scene is developing, it hears in the very first verse that as he was going along, Jesus saw an anthropon, blind from birth. The Greek word anthropon literally means a human. If they wanted to use the word for a man, it would have been aner, which John's gospel uses over and over. But this is the one time where it specifically uses anthropon, not anthropos. And also, it leaves off the article that goes before, where we would say a man or a human or the man or this man. It leaves that out completely, which almost never happens in the Greek. Here what we see is John is very specifically leading a clue, which will become revealed later in this gospel passage, that the man who is born blind is not simply one person, not the man, not a man, but rather a person representing all of human beings. All of us are born blind to who Jesus is what John's gospel wants to make clear. It's not one person, but every part of humankind is represented in this person who was born blind. And so when at the end of the passage we hear the Pharisees and the Jews say together, are we blind? In an ironic statement, the answer is yes. It could be that Jesus is trying to sing a Grateful Dead song that Jim Bullitt would sing a whole lot better than me. So I'll just tell you what the lyric is. The trouble with you is the trouble with me. Got 2 good eyes and you still can't see. It's in the middle of the song Casey Jones, just so you know, okay? The trouble with you is the trouble in me. Got 2 good eyes and you still can't see. Jesus reflects on the blindness of the person and realizes that this is the condition of all of us as we come. And Nicodemus has come blind, and he comes in darkness and wants to stay in darkness. The Samaritan woman is willing to come meet him at the well in the middle of the day, in the sunlight. And in that willingness to walk in the light, she sees the true source of light. And she walks away as one who now knows God is the one who will grant her a new life. She is the one who actually, unlike Nicodemus, is willing to be born again from above. As always in John, the symbolism is strong in every single action, every single word. And you notice that Jesus spits on the ground, makes clay, takes the mud and puts it on the eyes. Saliva, like every other bodily fluid in Jesus' time, was considered to be unclean. It was not considered that you would ever take your spit and put it on anyone. That was making the other person unclean as well as you. But it has strong scriptural undertones. In Isaiah, you would have heard, "O Lord, now we are the clay, all of us. You, Father, are the one who will fashion us into a work of beauty. The work of your hands with this clay is what will make us a new people." And John's gospel has already told us that the living water comes out of Jesus, is flowing from Jesus to do the work of healing of the world, providing the water that will be living water that will transform and give life. And spit and soil are the primal elements you all know, because that's what God started when he formed and fashioned us. It says in the third chapter of the Garden of Eden, of the second chapter and the third, God reached down and took dirt, fashioned it with water, made clay, and out of that clay formed you and me, formed all human beings. That's how God starts the idea of creation. And what is happening here in John's gospel is God is saying, I'm giving you a second chance, because we're going to start creation all over again. All humanity is blind, but I'm going to show you that it is through my work that you now can receive the gift of sight one more time. So no matter if you can see or not see, today I am declaring it is a new kingdom. It is a new world. It's a new opportunity for life. And it comes through the gift that Jesus gives. The blind man is doing exactly what Nicodemus wouldn't do. He is being born again exactly the way Jesus told Nicodemus, through water and the Spirit, when he goes and takes the gift of God with that clay, with the Spirit of Jesus, and then goes and washes in the water of the pool of Siloam. And you see all the symbolism, how this is all fitting together, and it's tying together all the Old Testament prophecies and the actions of God, and now saying, today I declare there's a new creation beginning again. Nicodemus goes away with all the hesitation. The blind man goes to the pool of Siloam without 1 second of other thought. And the rest of the thing, you picked it up, I heard you, some of you. What follows in the rest of the conversation in this gospel is almost like slapstick comedy. The best way we could ever tell this gospel would be to create a little, play in front of you and have this poor blind man who now sees going back and forth, and people are questioning him and almost putting him on trial, and then his parents enter the scene. And the people, instead of attacking the blind man, they start to attack his parents. And his parents say, hey, go ask him. He's of age. He can answer his own questions. Because they don't want to get in the middle of the conflict, they avoid it. And you start to see how all this goes step after step after step. And what John's gospel is helping us see is, how do we react when we see someone who has been in need, needs our help, and what do we do about it? And can we rejoice with people who have rejoicing, and actually lament with people who are needing people to lament? It's all a staged play in a real sense to show us all the conditions of how we respond to things that are going on all around us. Here's a person who now sees, and we want to give thanks. Instead, what happens is the Pharisees and the people who are Jesus' adversaries instead don't focus on the rejoicing. My gosh, this guy who's been blind from birth now sees. What a great day, right? That's one approach. What you see instead is, who healed you? And did it happen on the Sabbath? How did that happen? If somebody's doing work on the Sabbath, they're violating God's rules. And we are the keepers of the rules. And you see how the different ways of responding to what should be good news takes place, completely different kinds of reactions and responses. When I was in Alabama, one of my good friends, a preaching partner of sorts, was the black guy who was the pastor of the AME church that was about 4 or 5 blocks. Some of you have heard about him before. His name was L.C. Green, and he was about this big. I can't reach to the top, but looked like he'd been an offensive lineman in the NFL. He and I would get together and would do some preaching at different places. I had him come to St. Mary's, our Episcopal church on the one end of the long street. And when he was there, it was the first time they'd ever had a black person preach in St. Mary's. And I still remember what he did. He started talking about, have we ever seen anyone who was in real need? And some timidly held their hand up. And he said, well, stand up. And he made people stand up, which was very unusual in the middle of the service. And then he said, okay, now sit down. How many of you have never really seen people who are oppressed? And a few were raising hands, but not very many. And he said, well, you know what? It's because you chose not to see. You're blind to the world. In the village that you live, in this city in which we live, there are people who are poor and oppressed and don't have all the things you take for granted. And the only reason you don't see them is because you don't look. You don't open your eyes. And he made such an impression. You know, we really are oftentimes blind to things right next to us. All we have to do, as Jim Pernitti was telling me the other day, someone said, if you want to see the differences and people who don't have what you have, just go to the Walmart parking lot and stand and look around, right? It's right in front of us, right? But you have to have eyes that are open to see. And when we do, L.C. Green said, the problem with most Christians is they think all with their head. And I still remember him marching up and down the center aisle as he's preaching, which I had never done. But he said, all of you think with your head. He said, now hit your head when I do it. And we're all going like this. And he said, what you need is to think with your heart. You need to have the eyes of your heart working as well as the eyes of your head. You need to connect the two. Your head and your heart need to be connected. And if they're not, you'll never know what to do. Because you're always thinking with your head and thinking about solutions when actually we don't need solutions, we need action. Because action is what will be the solution, not standing by and observing and reflecting. And the problem with the disciples is they do exactly that. The disciples see suffering right in the very first passage, and they turn it into a class on theology. What caused this man's blindness? Was it sin from his own self while he was in utero? Or was it his parents who sinned? And Jesus says, what are we talking about? He didn't sin before he was born, and it's not his parents who sinned. It's there so we can do something. The disciples see suffering as something to reflect upon. Jesus sees suffering as something that should be acted upon, that we ought to go and do. Much like Zach Newman has gone to places where they needed to learn how to read better and to have schools built, and he spent summer after summer after summer in Ghana because he knew with a team of people from Ghana and here, together they could do something. And he didn't spend his time reflecting on the theology. Instead, he went and he did something. And this is part of what we see in this gospel, is Jesus is less interested in our reflection and more interested in, are we going to do something? And then when something happens, can we rejoice? It's doing the work of God, he says, not doing moral theology. That is what's essential to you and me and being a disciple of Jesus. Chris just had her cataracts removed in the last week. And like I did 10 years ago and had mine removed, she walked out of the doctor's office and I'm driving her home and she's saying, wow, things are blue. They're really blue. And look at that grass, it's green, it's really green, you know? And I remember having that same experience. And the job, that's exactly what Jesus is doing for us, is clearing our eyes, giving us the ability to see and see the beauty that's been created, see the needs that are in front of us, and to act on them and rejoice with them. Open the eyes of your heart, Lord. Open the eyes of your hearts. Amen.